thanks all for joining. For the way that we want to do this Q&A session, basically tailored towards those who either were not there 2 weeks ago or have more questions now. We want to actually first see what how many of you have watched the recording of the webinar, or actually the original webinar 2 weeks ago live, and how many of you have filled out the survey. For that, we have here Inga Menke, who will talk you through a Menti question.
Yes. So for those of you who have never done this, you can either scan the QR code or go to menti.com and key in this number, and then you should get to this little questionnaire. So we have 2 questions. So we basically want to know first if you saw the recording, because it will help us understand how much information we need to repeat here, or not, and then we will dive more into questions straight away. Oh, I think last couple of people.
It's a race.
It is a race. Okay, I think we can move to the next slide. So we know it's a 50-50. The other question we have, because obviously that's important for us to understand, have you already filled in the survey? And if not, we obviously hope that you do so after this webinar.
Yeah, I find the people who say no here very honest, but I would hope they would actually say we'll do after this webinar.
Couple more people missing. All right, I think yeah, I think we can get started with the content. So I will stop sharing.
Yeah, thanks for that. And now it's 50-50 of people who have seen it, which meant I've said if it's less than 60, I'm going to do a very brief recap of what we had. So I hope we don't lose the people who actually have already seen the webinar, but think it's helpful to then really briefly recap what the plans are that we would want to discuss, and we also have now this hour to get your questions on. So this is about thinking what's beyond the current scenario framework of the shared socioeconomic pathways, especially on the socioeconomic side, on how that can evolve on the longer term into something new. We stand in a long tradition of community level scenarios. For example, in the context of the IPCC, going back to the 1990s, in different incarnations of different generations of scenarios. Also, more recently, we've seen developed of, for example, the Nature Futures framework on the side of biodiversity research. And so in the context of those, in that tradition of long-term future-oriented scenarios, and especially the socioeconomic-oriented ones, the SSPs, we have to sort of start thinking what comes next from where we are now. The aims of these community level frameworks are, and especially of the SSP framework actually, was really to support climate change related research across many different research communities and across different scales, sectors, and topics. to facilitate the research that integrates both climate and society, and to foster then also the considerations of uncertainty, to have this coherent synthesis also of scientific assessments, and eventually also inform policy. And so this is quite a wide-ranging ambition, basically, that the scenario framework originally had in mind. Some of these were more successful than others, and there's of course some review papers looking into that, which ones were better taken up and which ones were less achieved. But now, if we think forward, the question is also, are these still the right goals for such a framework? As part of the framework, basically keeping scenarios up to date is a major issue from the beginning, right? Because scenarios sort of get out of date quickly because society develops in a certain direction, and especially these weeks, sometimes society is changing under our feet, and it's hard to keep up actually with how we think about the future, with how the present actually looks. But if you think of scenarios on the community level, there is this inherent tension between making revisions to make them up to date and to have a stable set of scenario information. And so different components of these scenario frameworks actually have their own speed of staying up to date. Some quantitative elements like population, GDP, IEM scenario quantifications have some regular updates. Earth system models sort of seem to go at the speed of CMIP projects, IPCC cycles, so every 7-8 years. Narratives and the framework itself, in the case of the SSPs, the axes of challenges to mitigation, challenges to adaptation, should be more stable. But at the same time, we've had that now for about 10-15 years, and the question is whether that really still works as well as we envisioned, and whether we shouldn't be thinking about something else to be there a few years from now. And so there is this growing mandate for starting to evolve this. Over the past few scenarios forums, basically this discussion kept coming up, and it kept coming up actually more strongly. That even though the SSPs are very widely used and successful, they are also very climate-centric in their approach, and so there would be reasons for today's interconnected challenges to maybe think more holistically about climate, nature, and development. Other shortcomings that people sort of have ran into and that are much harder to sort of keep to work with in the current framework is that we have no policy, no impact baselines that are increasingly artificial, because we are living in a climate work that in a world that has either climate policies that are in place or climate policies that are being rolled back. And also in terms of impact, we live in a world basically where the impacts are slowly increasing, and so no impact is no longer it becomes hard to even produce those kind of baselines in a meaningful way. Equity has become much more important as a topic than it was basically at the time, and is not fundamentally and explicitly enough included. And it turns out to be hard to actually work with the SSPs across scales, so people run into issues there. And so that's why the Iconic Steering Committee basically said, okay, well, we want to initiate that we start to think and help facilitate a discussion in the community of how we can evolve this framework further. And we said one direction of travel, and otherwise a lot is open here. But in terms of direction, we said we want to at least think about this in terms of evolving, and at least at the beginning, and then we'll see during the process how revolutionary this is going to be. We want the framework to be able to be staying up to date, but also to be more holistic and looking at both development, climate, and nature, all three of those in a connected way. Be solution-oriented, be fit for both for research, be fit for using in assessments, or at least enabling assessments, and for more user-facing applications, and reflect more diverse perspectives. And so initiated, as I mentioned, by the Iconics steering committee, implemented through working groups, basically of Iconics. The ambition to be as diverse and open in participation as possible, but also as a way where Iconics basically facilitates this discussion for the community. And so what we've set out is, when we've started thinking about this process, is we probably need a few phases to actually bring the thinking further and and make some decisions along the way. And this is the process that we've set out, that we've thought up to basically bring the community along over the next few years. So if we think about it in terms of the timeline, if we look at the next decade, if we think of if we think of where the time window is to actually now rethinking this work, thinking of major products that are on the horizon, we have in the first few years, we have the IPCC AR7 still going on. We have the IPBES global assessment being written. The SDGs on the more socioeconomic side are the targets are due in 2030, and there's the thinking of what does a post-SDG world look like, and what does post-SDG thinking in the UN context look like. And then if you think of further into the next decade, basically we'll have an IPCC 8 assessment report, hopefully, and also on the side of IPBES and other applications, basically there's other products coming in the next decade. All of these efforts have their related research activities. We have here, CMIP 7 with scenario MIP. We have ECMIP with impact research. We have on the side of IPBES, there's bending the curve and other activities. And then in the 2030s, you would again think of something like CMIP 8 that needs new emission scenarios, and also an IPBES post-2030 work program. So if you think of these kind of contexts, there is a time window now in the next 5 years, basically, to have the discussion of evolving the framework. We still have the SSP framework now, and that's underlying what's happening, for example, in scenario MIP and CMIP 7. It's used widely in the literature that's going to be assessed in IPCC AR7. And this will remain having its relevance basically in the next few years, but at the same time, we now have a time window of 5 years to think of something new that can be used and grow into being used in the 2030s. And if we want to take the time to also have that process be elaborate and inclusive, and we want to try things where we want to maybe roll back and then actually try other things, we need the time for that. We need to get started basically now in order to be ready at some point and not be stressed with that process. So if we think of these 5 years, we envision basically 3 phases. And the most important at this point is the fact that we say we are going to do this, and we are going to ask the community for your input and your thoughts. So start thinking basically about what can be done. Now, this is this first phase of community input where we collect views, proposals, and ideas, and open to a lot here. A second phase is around making decisions a bit more. So thinking about scenario framework design, we think about this in terms of organizing an expert workshop that takes in all of these inputs from the first community input phase and discusses what can be done as a scenario framework proposal in the future, but then take a very long review phase with also their regional and global level review steps, basically, for people to give feedback on that. That needs to close at some point with another decision of how you would how you then really move, and then we envision that there would be a quantitative scenario design phase. And we do this on purpose, very, very open, because every discussion you start on this topic, basically, ideas start to go quite widely in different directions. And so it's very hard to determine a priori what this whole process might look like. And it could well be that we need to revise it, or that we go into a certain direction of scenario frameworks that just needs a slightly different process. During this first community input phase, we have set up 3 activities on 3 pillars, and there might be more. And if you have suggestions for more, we're all very open to that. One is an SSP user survey. This is an important first step. Then an academic paper collection, a place where the community can basically bring together their thought through ideas of how things can be done better, and workshops and conference sessions to facilitate the conversation, basically. And that should all feed into this expert workshop for next year. Yeah, so here, the first thing that we have, and now I have to juggle a little bit and stop this sharing and share another screen. And Jonathan is not with us because of some sick child reasons. But what we have here in this, and you should be seeing now my the SEP website. So we have the scenario evolution process website, sep.du.edu. We try to keep this as simple as possible, where we lay out what the process is, how you can get involved, what the current thinking is, and where any news also indeed on upcoming webinars will be spread. What is the most important phase at this point is the survey here. If you go to this website, go to survey, you'll find a survey where we ask people who have really different levels of familiarity, basically, with the SSPs, of what your thoughts are of how things can be done better. And that helps us to steer where to emphasize meetings, where to emphasize topics to be discussed also over the course of the next year. So it's really, really important for us in this process that you go in and fill this out. Even if you have not worked with the SSPs that much, there's a separate track that's shorter where you can still give your opinion. If you have, and you're an expert user, or either a consumer or a user of scenario level information, you'll get a few more questions and different questions, but very important for this process to that you fill this out, and we'll share the link during this webinar further for you to fill this out. The other step is around the academic paper collection, and for this I'll ask Vanessa Schweitzer to join me here and talk us through this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, boss. So I'm Vanessa Schweitzer, and to tell you a bit about what we're trying to do with the academic paper collection, we basically want to create a forum through different written pieces about what is desired from a socioeconomic scenarios framework, where we're writing the papers now in 2026, but we're thinking forward to what it is that scenarios need to be doing to support the way we think about the future of societies, also the way that this interacts with climate, but then also biodiversity concerns. And there, might be other angles as well, right? Perhaps people want to talk about global health. But nevertheless, this particular image here, trying to point out that we're very aware that existing frameworks, right? They were designed at a time, they served a certain purpose at the time that they were put together. And we want to be sensitive to how often when people actually try to use these designs, something else will emerge about the shortcomings of that design. And so what you're seeing in that image there with the user experience, where this person's carving out a new path that is desired but didn't exist from the original design, this is where we really want to have people giving submissions that are really focused on like the desires of what an evolved framework ought to be doing. So the other bullets on this slide are just reiterating what Boss has said so far in this overview presentation. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Boss. And so in terms of how we're thinking that academic papers can also be a way that we have exchanges of ideas. We are working on securing a journal that will host this virtual special issue. We have our own thinking about what kinds of contributions we would like people to submit has been evolving as well. So originally we wanted to encourage full-length journal manuscripts, but we realized that actually, even if people can just really flesh out a component of what an updated framework really ought to be doing, that's where something that's a bit shorter, maybe something that's more like a perspective piece, only 3,000 words, would also be good. But that's like where, actually articulating what would be desired in writing is really helpful for this kind of community process and getting everyone on the same page. Another key thing that we want to do through this publication pipeline is to encourage people when they submit their manuscripts to simultaneously post the manuscripts as preprint articles. So for example, SSRN is a place that perhaps papers would be going to. Again, this will all be clarified further on the SEP website once we do finalize which journal we will be working with. But we really are trying to encourage that exchange while the papers are in peer review. So we're still on our proposed timeline, right, where we do anticipate that the formal call for submissions will be coming out later this month or perhaps in April. And we want to give people about 6 months to have their papers in that peer review process, also having their papers posted on a preprint article site. This overall timeline ultimately is to prepare for in 2027 that expert workshop that Boss mentioned, so that we have these written inputs that can then feed into that verbal exchange that's going to happen during the 2027 expert workshop. So I think that concludes how I would introduce this particular stream of activity. And I'll hand it back to Boss.
Thanks, Vanessa. And in the meantime, any questions that you might have, post them in the Q&A of Zoom, because then we have also a few people here who can help answer with those. Good. The third stream that we have is on workshops and conference sessions. And this one, again, here, most concrete in the first phase. We are now here at the kickoff webinar. Basically, we are planning one splinter session at the EGU this year. Probably more sessions coming in this year, simply because there's more conferences, and your suggestions for conferences where this could be done or where you would want to help and carry a discussion session on this topic. Please also add those in the chat here, and later we'll give you some other contact mechanisms as well. The way we at the moment envision the workshop part of the second phase is to have lots of review meetings and regional or maybe also sectoral workshops, basically focused on individual communities to review what comes out of as a proposed scenario framework out of this expert meeting, and to have this conversation and to facilitate this conversation between thinking of what a framework looks like and thinking from a user and other perspective, whether that all works in all of the cases that people actually foresee and how they would be using these scenarios. And so that's the way that we envision going about meetings at this point, but this depends to a large extent on funding that also still needs to be arranged and secured. Yeah, and in between these different steps, we are basically starting to organize also the Scenarios Forum for 2027 that will take place in Korea in the fall of 2027. 2029, we would expect another Scenarios Forum, and these are also important places basically where this conversation of the community of what can happen next can be facilitated. Yeah, so this is the way to do this. To have lots of involvement basically from people and also have more in-person involvement. Here's already, if you have ideas for how we can actually, for funding, if you can help us secure funding, you can reach us at sep@du.edu. If you have suggestions for conferences where we can organize these kind of sessions, if you want to be involved here, also please reach out at sep@du.edu. And then we'll organize these sessions at the different upcoming workshops. One concrete idea for one workshop is a scenarios experience workshop where we think about learning from other scenario processes, other fields that think of the future. And we hope to be able to actually organize this in the fall of 2026, where recognizing, of course, that scenario development is not only an academic climate-related activity, but it's a more common tool across many different disciplines and fields. And we want to sort of bring these people together in one place to actually discuss how we can learn from other experiences, both across societal, socioeconomic, and environmental issues. So here is the summary of how you can engage, basically, with us. We have now had this week 2 Q&A sessions. We'll organize more and also hopefully increasingly sort of more interactive, actually open format discussion platforms where we can have these exchanges within the community and facilitate that for the community. If you go to sep.du.edu, you'll find the website. If you have any feedback, want to reach out, email to sep@du.edu. Any other ideas of how we can collect community input, any ideas you might have also to help with your research and align your research with this. I have a few more slides before we really go into the Q&A, because we had some discussions. Basically, there was a lot of Q&A after the first webinar, and we had another session on Monday. And maybe to reflect a little bit on some of the themes that came up there. So one theme is the inclusivity and regional representation. And it's clear, I think we're all in this webinar and at that other earlier webinar also on the same page. Basically, there is a need for broader geographic coverage and involvement. And there's concerns about how we can actually make that happen, because the barriers to participation in terms of travel, in terms of funding, in terms of career stages are quite high. I think we also all agree that funding is important here, and that there's avenues towards that, but also your suggestions that go beyond our imagination on how this can be done better, how we can secure more inclusivity, are very welcome. One of the suggestions that came out of the first webinar was to actually indeed start organizing also regional working groups, and where regional champions basically would carry discussion of this topic and the evolution in their regions. Process transparency and community ownership was another theme, sort of topics that came up in the Q&A there. Of course, we'll share the survey results as soon as we can. We are trying to hit quite a large number of participants, so also please help us spread this widely and fill it out, because that's really, really essential for this process to help us find where to focus and emphasize on. There were requests for clear governance structures and transparent decision making, and we're taking that up, and we'll probably also have to we'll have the conversation around that also with the community here on how to make this happen. There were many suggestions for wider contributions, also especially from poetry, fiction, philosophical perspectives. Those are very, very welcome. I think we need a lot of creativity to help us think about the future differently. And there were some suggestions for events and venues already, and so we still would want more of those. Then we tried in the webinar mostly also to lay out the process and leave the content open. But nevertheless, when you start this conversation, it gravitates towards the content really quickly. And we should have the content discussion as well. So we shouldn't, but the focus of this first step is just saying, hey guys, we want to start this process, start thinking about this topic. These are the ways that we see this evolving. But there was discussion on how quantitative SSP elements actually would reflect the qualitative storylines at the moment. There were calls for different modeling approaches, wider narratives, especially on the post-growth, the more dystopian side, or unjust futures. Also calls for inclusion of non-traditional scenario drivers and quantifications. And another discussion focused basically mostly on incorporating discontinuities or emerging drivers. So on the one hand, we've seen major shocks. Of course, there was COVID-19, but also in terms of wars, economic crises, how can we deal with those better in a community level scenario framework, and also some things like, how can we expand the time horizons and things that we deal with. So this is about what I'd had to kick us off, and now we have around 25 minutes to look at questions, and I see based on how many participants we have here also, we can make this more interactive as well. And also here with a call to, I see we have we have quite a number of iconic steering committee members here on the panelist side, and those who want to come and chime in, please also do so and turn on your camera once you do that. Now I'm on my way to the Q&A sessions. There's not many questions so far. Vanessa, you answered that question. Could you maybe briefly summarize it while we wait for a few more to come in?
Yeah. So that was where Claude and I briefly had an exchange where Claude was concerned about skewing results in terms of not being an academic and whatnot. So the same thing that I wrote to Claude, I would encourage anyone who's on this call, do not remove yourself from survey participation because you're concerned you're not sufficiently expert. One of the things that we think is very important right now is that we have a better grasp on all of the different kinds of scenario users, including folks who are not academics, or perhaps people who just heard about the shared socioeconomic pathways recently. And so don't worry about your experience being a barrier, and please don't remove yourself from participating in the survey. So that's the first thing. In terms of something that I wanted to say also verbally, in terms of Claude in his question, also brought up a scenario called Too Little, Too Late, where others in the audience perhaps know more about this scenario than I do, but something where maybe someone like Claude and I have a mutual research interest. At the University of Waterloo in Canada, we have a lab called the Climate Intervention Strategies Lab. And one of the things that brings us together as a group of researchers is that we are concerned that things like widespread carbon dioxide removal, maybe other kinds of interventions like solar geoengineering, these ideas have been ancillary in scenarios if they are represented at all. And we're concerned that it would be a mistake to continue doing that in the next, as we're talking about how might we evolve the scenario framework. So in terms of a too little, too late kind of scenario, if it might, lead to different kinds of outcomes that, currently we haven't really thought very hard about what do those futures look like. This is where I want to, again, to sort of drum up people's creative juices, right? About do the current frameworks, are they sufficient for supporting that kind of research activity? Or if they are not, what are some ideas that we have about how we would evolve the framework so that it makes it more obvious how to support that kind of research? So yeah, that's my 2 cents to add for right now.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. And so actually, I see someone else wrote it in the Q&A as well, but I was just going to say that indeed the too little, too late type scenarios are emerging as the world is getting into a maybe too little, too late kind of dynamic. The Network for Greening the Financial System has these also in their matrix of scenarios, and it's indeed it's an important type of scenario that sits in a potential squeeze, of course, between doing mitigation and doing adaptation at the same time. You wanted to come in on that, Chris?
I do. I would like to come in on that. As humans, we all focus on the current moment and somehow think the current moment's reflective of the future. It wasn't that long ago that we had scenarios that were not exactly too little, too late, but were along that line. And we received so much negative feedback of how in 2015, how could you be so negative? And we explained we had to fill the scenario space, but back in 2015, too little, too late just seemed like it was going to be impossible. So we need all of the scenarios and a broad range of them. The other point I'd like to make is there's questions about, it's focus on creativity, but it's also a focus on qualitative. And the narratives have both narrative elements and quantifications. And there is a lot that goes into the narratives. And the narratives can be quantified, but not to the extent, of course, that you quantify GDP or population. And so there are opportunities for taking those narratives and thinking about how to use them in some quantitative analysis, but also can be directly used in qualitative analyses. Thanks.
Thanks. And Paula, I think you indicated you wanted to come in on that topic as well, right?
Yeah, I can very briefly because so Chris was touching on it, but I've created scenarios a lot more at the regional scale rather than the global scale, and in those co-creation approaches, worked with artists a lot. So we've worked with illustrators, with poets, people who created art installations that sort of portray the different scenarios. And people who've done dance routines and things like that also. And sometimes I think there's two ways you can sort of co-create with stakeholders. Part of it is as bringing artists in as part of the process, and that's often to open mindsets and bring a diversity of views, perspectives, and priorities into the scenarios themselves. And another is it's to sort of illustrate the scenarios themselves as outcomes and what they might look like to make them more accessible to other people. And then as Chris was sort of saying, you then get a much richer description of the scenario narrative that has brought in many different values and perspectives. And then the challenge is, how do you do that translation from the qualitative to the quantitative? And there are many different approaches to allow us to do that. But at the same time, even when you do that translation, the narrative and the artistic interpretations of that narrative is an equally important output of the scenarios process and outcome itself as the modeling outcomes, and they should be viewed side by side, because ultimately models are always simplifications of reality, and you can capture a lot more detail in that narrative process. And then bringing many different disciplines together into that narrative process is really rich. So again, very much encourage creative processes as part of this new scenario evolution process.
Thank you. Alex, on the same topic?
Yeah, just also building off what Vanessa was saying, I think, and what Chris was saying, it is very interesting to us to see how different groups are interested in different parts of the distribution in terms of, different futures that might be more or less extreme, depending on your risk tolerance, depending on the types of decisions that you have to make. So that's interesting feedback, I think, to all of us. It's also worth noting that, the quantification of scenarios is effectively a specific iteration where numbers are needed within a scenario kind of story space that might not need to be so precise, or I should say is not so restricted. The storyline kind of keeps our ability to understand different projections, even as we're not making a specific numerical prediction of some sort. And just as an example, in recent years, another anecdote here, a few years back, everybody was saying there's nothing like RCP 8.5 that could be possible anymore, because the difference between the cold usage assumptions in that quantified version of RCP 8.5 and what was happening in the world didn't seem possible. But at the time, we were pushing back and saying, what if there's some new technology coming that is highly desirable but energy intensive? And of course, we can all fill in the gap of what that might be nowadays, with AI and data centers and other things like that. And who knows what the future, will bring in those realms as well. So this is important for us to think about the extreme edges, but also kind of what tipping points or stochastic type things might shift not just the endpoint, but the trajectory of how we get there. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Brian, you wanted to come in here as well, right?
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, this was triggered by Robin's question about qualitative, quantitative. And I want to just emphasize too that yes, as people have said, there's a qualitative component of scenarios and in the narratives, and narrative development can be done in lots of different ways, and that's an opportunity for a lot of qualitative work. But I also want to emphasize that, I don't know, you could call it qualitative. I would say conceptual is before we get to any of that, there's a bunch of work, discussion, decisions that need to be made on what is this even about? What is the conceptual framework? How would we know that a qualitative narrative that we develop is a good one? How would we know that it is interesting, that it is useful, that it fits the framework? What is the framework? So scenarios are supposed to capture or represent or span an uncertainty space. Uncertainty in what? Right? That we don't know that yet. So all of that needs to be figured out, right? So last time it took a long time for the SSPs to figure out what uncertainty are we spanning. And ultimately the idea was this is about climate. And so we're going to span uncertainty in how well societies can adapt to climate change and how well societies can mitigate climate change. That's our uncertainty space. Then, knowing that, you're able to say, is this a good scenario that achieves that goal, that spans this space or not? But until we come up with, well, this time around, are these about climate? Are we spanning mitigation and adaptation capacity? What should they be about? What outcomes are of interest? So I just want to emphasize there's a lot of work that took a long time last time, and that has no models or anything like that. It's just thinking about this stuff. So there's a lot of opportunity to contribute to these really fundamental questions about, what comes next in scenario frameworks.
Yeah, good point. Not to get indeed too far ahead of ourselves of thinking about concrete or specific scenarios, but actually that we have this first conceptual step first to make. And it's not only what that, no, another example of that is what could you do across regions, right? How does this need to be the same type of thinking in every region? Or can we have slightly different framings in different regions of how the framework actually could work? And thinking that through, discussing that is one of these themes that could also could run into a paper into the special issue, for example, so that someone has given that some thought. And to get that back maybe to the creativity theme, all of this requires us to think actually quite out of the box, and especially I think when it comes to where it comes to framings and conceptual thinking, definitely, but also where it comes then to starting to think of what future scenarios could look like well before we actually quantify them. I think we need the support of creative thinkers of how the world can actually change from the direction it's currently on into different directions, and what kind of forces could be the ones changing society in different directions. Otherwise, we might set up ourselves to be very narrow. Let me see. I might have missed a few questions that came in the meantime. I see that here Christoph is asking about whether the structural decision that we had in the past for decoupling socioeconomics from climate, nature, policy, impact dimensions is up for discussion. And I would basically say at this point about everything is up for discussion, because as soon as we started this discussion, it became clear, like, yeah, you can tweak things here and there, and maybe that's what's going to happen. But there is a need to think through what can be done fundamentally more or differently than it is in the current decoupled SSP, RCP, or SSP and emission scenarios. And so, yes, I think a lot is up for discussion and for rethinking. And this is also basically a kickoff to get all your brains sort of running in a direction that's hopefully also constructive.
If I could add
Chris, you want to come in?
more thing to that, Boz, that thinking creatively, more and more communities are using the SSPs, communities that were not envisioned at the beginning. And so what you've said, Brian, and others have said is we really do welcome these new communities coming in and hearing from you what you would like to see if we're going to do a redesign. And that will help ensure that whatever comes out of this process and whatever then is going to be used for the next decade-ish, that it does reflect a much broader set of users and perspectives. Thanks.
Thanks. I see here from Adrian a few questions. One with an idea where you say you do these future persona video interviews, asking people to consider what living in a future scenario might influence their working environment. That sounds like a very interesting way, actually, to think, to bring people's imagination towards what the future could look like. And that's indeed those are the types of methods, also again on the creative side, that can help us actually indeed break through too narrow thinking.
If I could add quickly to that, Adrian, if you haven't seen, I suggest looking at Finscapes, which was a process in Finland to develop regional, subnational scenarios that included artists. And they have these amazing drawings for 4 of the SSPs where these communities did envision what that future would look like. And there's been processes in other countries, such as New Zealand, but the only one that I know of that included the artists, so that you can go look at these renderings of the different worlds. They're really quite helpful. Thanks.
Yes, if I can just build on.
Yes, you can.
Build on what I was saying there. Yes, what I actually did was to give different people. So first of all, I live in the Caribbean. I work in the Caribbean, and I went around some people that I know in different professions in different islands and gave them different outline scenarios and said, in that scenario, how do you think that would affect your working environment? The most interesting one actually came from the water sector, which is where I do a lot of work, where actually the person who I approached then sat down with his senior management and went through, and it really triggered their thinking about how they perform would perform and prepare for the future. So it was really interesting to see that feedback, and this is something, and I take the point about regional scenarios. I think this is something I'd like to explore a lot more and look at other ways, looking at these future personas. And I think there are huge opportunities, maybe even to reach out to school children and things like that who can have very vivid imaginations. Anyway, that's just an experience that I've had. But
Yeah.
I go back to my previous point.
Yes,
Sorry.
I wanted to ask you about that. That's why I asked you to unmute and to come in, is for that other question that you asked, and especially the part where you say there doesn't seem to be an appetite to use scenarios to inform this, and whether you could elaborate and explicify that a little bit and briefly, please, because we have a few more questions that we want to cover.
Very briefly, I've done about 3 or 4 different green climate fund applications for the water sector, and there's almost a set format. You have to talk about what the future impacts are going to be, but really they don't want to look at different future climate manifestations and how those would impact the solutions that you come up with. It's like they only seem to be interested in one scenario and responding to that scenario. And this is the Green Climate Fund, which is out there. And we're talking of investments, for example, in the water sector that can last 50 and 70 years. So surely we should be encouraging them, or there should be some encouragement to look at, this is stress testing. Yeah. This is, this is looking at how fit for purpose is this going to be, but we're not doing it. It doesn't seem that we're doing it. We've gone back to a formula. You go A plus B plus C equals Z.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating that. That's indeed, it's not only there. Also, one sees that much more widely, actually, of course, on many more places where people just look for the one scenario that fits there. Either it's their what they then consider a forecast, or it fits with their expectations, and then they use that. And that's, of course, there's a lot of maybe education to do on the scenario user side.
Yes, I think that's the point. I think that's the point. People don't quite realize the usefulness of this approach informing thinking. I'll shut up now.
Thank you. I want to see if my colleague Elmar is here to help answer one question that we got, and otherwise I frame it myself. But hi, because there is here a question about the what is it? The development-centered pathway, or what's the? You're muted.
Yes, the DSP process. I can say a few words about this. So DSP stands for Development Focused Socioeconomic Projections. And it started basically from the integrated assessment community, which is using the shared socioeconomic pathways as an input to their models, particular GDP, population, but also the narratives are playing a role in establishing parameter values on demand, for example, dietary change. And the community is facing criticism that they don't take into account to a sufficient degree equity considerations. And equity considerations, of course, are multi-layered. But one layer is assumptions about socioeconomic futures that are more equitable than today. Now, if you look at the SSPs, there is, for example, SSP1, that the convergence, for example, in income is optimistic compared to current trends. But still, you can make the point that we really would like to have a more normative component and look what are development priorities in the global south, and then build them in explicitly. And so the idea is, it was to say, okay, let's put out a call for academic groups who are working on economic forecasting, for example, to build a global projection where these development priorities in the global south are built in more explicitly. And it was basically saying if those development-focused projections would be produced, then the integrated assessment community in this particular project, it's called New Pathways, would be willing or would be very happy to take this up. And so this is what we're trying to do now, to find institutions that would work on this. And I stopped talking now, but I will put a link in the chat that would send you to the expression of interest that I was referring to. Thank you.
Thanks, Elmar. Let me then maybe say in a few words that this is a valuable process sort of in itself. It's related in a way. If people ask for how is it related to the scenario evolution process, I think it's something that it's on a much shorter time frame, and it's something that can feed into potentially what new scenarios could look like. And these are the types of experiments basically also with other scenarios that could become community level scenarios that we actually might need and might want to see over the next 1 to 2 years. Yeah, I see also people do need to leave. We are at the top of the hour. So let's not drag this on for too long. And that makes maybe to one final point is that, as always, sort of the fact that we have community level scenarios should not impede or stop anyone from looking also at other more creative out of the box individual scenarios in any other context, because that's where we don't have to wait until a new scenario framework for these development centered socioeconomic pathways also to be around in the literature. With that, I see this people start to leave, and that's rightly so because we are at the top of the hour. Thanks a lot for joining us, and stay tuned to the website sep.du.edu. Email your suggestions sep@du.edu, because we will host more of these webinar sessions and increasingly interactive. Thank you.